big shout out to Mahesh and Sal for being the heartbeat of DePIN. The bullishness really gets me going. Do I have a little clicker, Mahesh? Is it over here? I'll get it. Yeah, no worries. Okay, so I thought what would be fun, Kaledora and I met, I don't know, a while ago, and we fell in love talking about trading commodities. I used to trade commodities before crypto, and I worked in the oil and gas industry. So we're going to do kind of a slightly different session. We're going to do a quick rip that's a history on what happened to commodity markets, in particular oil, and the importance of really deep derivative markets. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the role Ostium is going to play in bringing liquidity to DePIN and making it possible for financial speculators to bring liquidity to the DePIN space. So hopefully that sounds interesting. So let's rip. We're going to make it quick. All right. So I always like to say there's nothing new under the sun. We just repeat things over and over again. So oil markets. Who here has heard of Standard Oil? Yeah, okay, so Standard Oil was the modern monopoly. Started as a small refiner, this guy named Rockefeller, right? He built it. Started just buying up a bunch of refiners. This is called horizontal integration. He basically rolled up the entire US refinery space in the late 1800s when oil was first becoming an asset. And he was really frustrated because the trains that transported his oil were basically taking advantage of him. And so he said, screw them, I'm going to buy a railroad. And so he began vertically integrating into the transportation and logistics component of the oil and gas value chain. Then he was like, wait a minute, why am I paying for crude? I could just produce my own crude. Started buying exploration and production assets. And before you know it, he streamlined operations, lowered costs, and could undercut basically anyone in the oil business because he owned the whole value chain. And this is basically how the modern monopoly got built. In the early 1900s, Standard Oil controlled basically the entirety of the oil industry in the US, 80%. And in 1911, Congress stepped in, broke Standard Oil up into 34 different companies, and those 34 companies over the years have become what is now sort of the 7 super majors. So really the legacy of Standard Oil and the economies of scale in commodity markets, I think, are really important sort of precedent for what DePIN might look like. Today, DePIN has a lot of different types of operators, from the hobbyists running helium nodes. Now we're starting to see more professional operators. And we also have really large-scale data center operators who are starting to get involved in DePIN. But how do we keep DePIN from becoming monopolized and commoditized? We need markets. So let's talk about the value chain. So in the oil and gas value chain, I kind of talked through vertical integration and horizontal integration, but I think this is also going to happen in DePIN, and we're already starting to see this. If you're building a network, maybe you're building an orchestration or a network topology optimization interface to help sort of streamline operations of the network. Maybe on top of that, you're going to build a consumer interface. Maybe on top of that, you build your own marketplace. So this integration is something we're already starting to see in the DePIN space, and I think it's only going to accelerate. Volatility is a bitch. Volatility is a really, really important aspect of why commodity markets are so important. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit about the different ways you can hedge out your exposure to volatility. But basically, if you look at the price of oil, right, from the 1970s through the early 2000s, you had all of these different geopolitical events that basically caused all of these really interesting dislocations in the price of oil. And if you're an oil producer or you're participating anywhere in sort of the oil value chain, there's no way for you to hedge out this risk. You basically just had to hope that your scale and your size and the integration you had would allow you to survive and maybe take advantage of these dislocations. But in the early 2000s, there's a little company called Enron that came along, and we went from open outcry trading, where people traded spot in the pit. I don't know if anyone here ever saw the COMEX pit back in the day. That's where it started. That then became NYMEX. That then became ICE. But the introduction of futures added a really interesting new twist, financialization. And we've seen this with Bitcoin, right? When I started in Bitcoin, you could only trade spot. Now the derivatives market on Bitcoin, particularly the perpetual swap market, outstrips the spot market by a factor of over 10x. Right? In oil, it's actually a factor of over 25x. But basically what you started to see, and again, parallels to DePIN, I think this is the story that's going to unfold over the next 10 years in this industry. You start by sort of optimizing your own buying and selling. And again, regardless of whether or not you disintermediate the CapEx and OpEx burden by distributing your network, your underlying network participants are still exposed to really high capital expenditures and really high operating costs because they're consuming power and bandwidth and storage and all of these different resources. So today, basically, every oil company has gone from optimizing their own sales to, which is called hedging, right, all the way through this sort of spectrum to arbitrage and pure speculative trading. And what's really interesting that doesn't get talked about, because nobody breaks out the profits from their trading business unit in their annual reporting, trading comprises most of the profitability of oil and gas companies. That's how foundational it is. So again, as we look at the DePIN space, why am I talking about this? I think this is where DePIN is going to go unless we do a few things with Ostium, potentially. So from physical to paper, physical, basically, you're taking delivery of the underlying, right? You have to physically give a barrel of oil to someone. Price is driven by supply and demand. There's capacity that's limited by supply, but you have really limited market participants, lower liquidity, because not everyone can take delivery of a barrel of oil. And your primary risk is really logistics, storage, right? That could be political risk as well. On the paper trading side, once we had the advent of an oil futures and derivatives market, you could basically speculate on the price of oil without ever having to touch a barrel of oil. Right? That's the beautiful thing about the perp and Bitcoin. You never actually have to touch Bitcoin. Everything is cash settled. You don't actually have to be exposed to Bitcoin. That's why the CME market is so popular, right? Prices are affected by broader macro factors. It's also really sentiment driven, right? There can be a big dislocation between the price of spot, i.e. physical oil, versus the price of futures. Your liquidity is basically unconstrained, right? You can create many, many multiples more than actual underlying supply, and you're able to be responsive to demand, which creates deep liquidity. And the risk is increased price volatility. Futures, derivatives markets can be incredibly volatile. They can move incredibly quickly. So these interesting sort of trade-offs in terms of product construction, and we'll dig a bit into why perps are kind of the optimal vehicle for DePIN derivatives. And really, at the end of the day, liquidity rules everything around me. I made this chart in Perplexity, so it's not the greatest, but it saved me a lot of time. Shill for AI. So basically, if we look at 2000, when electronic trading first emerged, physical and paper were kind of on par in terms of annual trading volume. And this year, right, over sort of the last 2 decades, we've seen paper trading, i.e. non-physical, these derivatives, outstrip underlying spot by many, many multiples. And so again, I think it's interesting that the creation of these derivatives have actually allowed new market participants to come in. You now have ETFs who have exposure to commodities primarily through derivatives. You have funds who purely trade speculative exposure, and most banks now are adding commodities exposure to their book as well. So there's just been this massive opening of these markets and more market participants bringing more liquidity, trading in new ways. Again, we're going to see this in DePIN. We're just getting started. It's early days, but we're all going to be slinging these things on chain. So time is a flat circle. I think we're entering this new era, and the way I really think of DePIN, it's not just tech. This is the facilitation of new markets, and digital commodities are really a new market primitive. And the creation of digital commodities is going to allow DePIN and some of these underlying digital commodities to become standalone asset classes. So let's talk about what that means. I have a new firm, Crucible, and I focus on basically 3 verticals that I think matter in DePIN. One is technology innovation. I think there's a lot of demos happening over in this room, people talking about the underlying technology innovation, new networks they're building, new meta protocols, new tooling, new hardware, optimization of different routing topologies, privacy and obfuscation tools, which is something Rushi talked about with Movement. There's some firms that are focusing on operating leverage. I think this is going to expand a lot more. But these are just tools to help people sort of manage their fleets, manage routing, basically aggregation to build top of funnel demand, abstraction layers. And what I get really excited about that I don't think we talk about enough with DePIN is financial engineering. Financial engineering is the best kind of engineering because it allows market participants to access capital at very low cost. It creates novel new financing structures. We need to create a forward curve, right, to reduce volatility in USD income to DePIN network operators. And we get to create these net new digital commodities. So what does that mean practically? Let's take compute as a really tangible example, because I think compute is probably the best known DePIN vertical today. When I talk about commodities or commodification, this is the process of turning something into a standardized tradable asset, right? So what is a standardized unit of compute? There are a few different approaches to this. Some people are, approaching it through the exaflop, which is something you would use for LLMs, AI. Other people are approaching it through sort of more traditional compute primitives. But DePIN is really enabling the creation of these discrete units of digital resource that can be bought, sold, and traded on a marketplace. So I sort of want to challenge you today to think of DePIN not just as these networks that facilitate these sort of core digital functions, but it's also the creation of new resources that can be traded. And so we kind of see this with compute, right? You started with on-prem or bare metal, really high CapEx, you had to buy all of your infra, really high OpEx because you have to hire people who run that infra for you, and it's really difficult to hedge or control costs. So then along comes cloud computing. You have no CapEx outlay, you don't need to buy anything, and the beautiful thing if you're a startup is your OpEx scales with the amount of compute you're consuming. So it's really quick and it's really scalable. Compute, though, through this process of more people shifting to cloud, became more commoditized, and basically the end buyers of compute lost most of their leverage, right? They're completely at the mercy of these hyperscalers, the AWSs, the Googles, who run these massive data centers that are co-located with their source of energy. And so it really created this lock-in, and I don't know how many of you have gotten insane computing bills for your cloud compute, but yeah, it gets pretty crazy pretty quickly. So you optimize for one set of parameters, but you lose flexibility on another set of parameters. I think the era we're in now, right, is DePIN, DeFi, and RWAs kind of coupled together are enabling a really wide range of operators with different CapEx capabilities to provide compute supply. If you look at Bitcoin, you have $20 billion of data center market value that have been created in Bitcoin. You have middleware and orchestration tools that are allowing people to streamline and aggregate demand. If you look at tools like ping pong, has anyone here used ping pong? On the compute side, okay? And then you can really fine-tune your costs by utilizing this network token. So where are the markets? This is where I want Kaledora, I guess, to tell us a little bit about what she's building at Ostium. So maybe we'll start with, like, what is Ostium? Why did you decide to build Ostium? Where are you starting? And then we can delve into some of the new market primitives we're gonna build to basically turn DePIN into a new commodity asset class.
Sure, thanks, Meltem. I'm Kaledora. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ostium. We are building on-chain perpetuals platform for real-world assets, and what I mean by RWAs is not only vertical expansion, which we see as bringing existing markets, real markets, that's FX, commodities, indices, ideally every liquid market on Earth, and bringing it on-chain as a perp, but also ultimately horizontal expansion, which I would define as sort of bringing these new markets that are generated by a lot of these DePIN protocols and creating perps on those. And maybe to connect this to what Meltem was talking about, I want to first give a little bit more context on sort of maybe a term that we've coined somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I think is a good representation of what we're doing, which is perpification, and contrast that with tokenization, because I think it'll lend relevant insights into why perps we think will be so important for preventing the sort of the end state of DePIN being basically replicating the existing structures and verticalization of the sort of energy markets or similar markets that I think are being brought on chain. So to dig into that, tokenization, the way I would define that broadly, is basically taking the model that has worked for Circle and Tether and applying that to other assets. So basically having a centralized off-chain holding company, having some minting and redemption process, and then representing that asset that is held in that off-chain company on-chain. So for stablecoins, this is fairly straightforward. You hold a dollar, you hold a sort of mix of dollars and some various T-bills with varying expiries. You have a minting redemption process, and then you have the asset represented on-chain. In the case of EVM chains, as an ERC20 token. That's obviously been replicated across other assets. You see this with, in 2022 especially, and going forward as interest rates have been high, replicated with various treasury products, largely because people wanted access to sort of off-chain yield. that makes a lot of sense if you want to actually have the token as a means of exchange, which is the case with a stablecoin, or you actually just sort of want to sit on the thing in the case of treasuries, but makes a lot less sense for assets that people actually largely want to trade rather than just sit on and hold or use as a means of exchange. And so we think that actually the sort of derivatives first or perps first approach to bringing assets that non-sort of digitally native assets on chain is radically under-discussed. I think it makes actually a lot less sense to try to onboard oil or copper or some equity index through tokenization when actually mostly what people want to do is trade it. And if you look at what has PMF in crypto, it's mostly trading. So what are we doing instead? We're taking an approach that I have sort of termed tongue-in-cheek perpification, but is basically a perps-first approach to onboarding these assets. And why is this relevant to everything that Meltem just discussed? So some background on perps, as I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with. Perps were first first introduced by crypto, but first written about in the 90s by Robert Shiller. He described perps as sort of this perpetual instrument where you are entitled to the cash flows of the underlying asset without actually needing to hold or settle in the underlying asset. And specifically described this as being relevant or important for markets where the underlying market was perhaps not so liquid or hard to access, or where the desire for actually settling in the underlying asset was limited, or actually it was worse to settle in the underlying asset. And I think we see a lot of parallels today to what's happening in DePIN. Maybe an energy market would be a good example, or some virtual power plant, for instance, kind of similar to what guys at Daylight are doing, where you actually don't really want to settle for the underlying thing. And perps are particularly good at connecting speculative capital with capital that has inherent demands for hedging. And I think you see this in the proliferation of perps. Given the choice between options and perps, people pick perps anytime.
I think right now, if you look at Bitcoin, right, perps sort of are 80 to 85% of the volume. Obviously, we've seen a little bit of uptick on the futures side, just because the CME futures are US dollar settled, and you can settle them via sort of the existing US capital markets infrastructure. But perps vastly, vastly outstrip the volume in any other sort of Bitcoin product.
And perps are the optimal instrument because they're actually pretty simple to understand. So, in contrast to options where you may be correct on the direction of whether things have, gone up or down, there's all sorts of other things you have to factor in, like implied volatility and other aspects that influence, that make them harder to understand. People often point to how well the options market has done for equities, but I would argue that options are kind of like the Churchill quote about democracy. They're like the worst option.
Options require calculus. We don't want to do calculus.
So perps have clearly taken off as the preferred primitive for sort of speculators, and they're great at connecting, because they're so simple to understand for speculators, they're great at connecting speculators with people who have some underlying demand for hedging. And this is where this all sort of comes together with DePIN. A lot of what Meltem outlined is that all of this entire stack was sort of vertically integrated early on in these markets because there was no good outlet for speculators. So if it's a highly volatile asset and there is no outlet for someone who is more speculatory driven to take the other side, kind of the only way for you as an entity that is somewhere in that value chain to manage risk is to basically internalize everything and make it entirely verticalized. And so in order to avoid replicating that same set of outcomes in these DePIN markets, it's really, really important to have financial markets that are effective at connecting people with some underlying demand that they have to hedge out. So they have have an inelastic demand curve basically for their holdings with speculatory capital. And this is where perps come together. We have 2 minutes left, so we're finally bringing everything together. I'll turn it back over to Meltem. I think she had a few questions.
Yeah, and I think we're going to try to wrap 2 minutes early because I know there's a tight schedule. But basically, Kaledora and I were excited about me as an investor. Kaledora as an entrepreneur who's building one of these markets is basically working with companies in the DePIN space to create various types of perps and various types of speculative contracts that can help hedge out volatility for various players in the DePIN value chain. If we want to have this vision that Mahesh talked about, at the opening of this event, where we don't see the same monopolistic players, we don't see the same centralization of power that we've seen in traditional sort of physical infrastructure, then we need to start with liquidity and robust capital markets first. So if you're excited about that, you want to build that, Kaledora and I are both terminally and chronically online. We're very easy to find. I think we'll both be wandering around for a bit here, so we'd love to chat with you, but markets rule everything around us. Speculation's very important, and so building networks, building new sort of architectures for how we construct networks in a more distributed manner is the starting point, but the ending point is and will always be deep liquidity, robust capital markets, and intense speculation. So let us go forth and build.
Yay.
Perpify everything.